Hello again. In this next section, I want to talk about some ways in which different ideas about class and some positions in the debate between Marx and Weber have been applied in some relatively more contemporary understandings of class. And I want to begin by talking about intersections between class and culture and the theory of Pierre Bourdieu. Now, Pierre Bourdieu asks the question, how is it that class positions are maintained, and how is it that people, even without a lot of financial capital, are able to enter advantageous class positions? What he argues is that there's a social environment in which the position that a person holds in a system of class differentiation and inequality is ascribed onto them so that it looks like a characteristic of the individual, a fundamental spiritual or psychological characteristic. This is what he calls the ideology of charisma, so that class places limitations on people by the fact that they are defined by other people as belonging or not belonging in a particular class space. And the way that he makes this systematic is by talking about different forms of capital. We know what economic capital is, right? This is basically what's described by Marx. And he argues that people have access also to other forms of capital, and this is differentiated. They have different forms, they have different levels of access to social capital, that is, networks and the ability to call upon the assistance of other people in order to solve problems in their lives or to gain access to positions like jobs. And they have different levels of access to cultural capital, that is, ways in which they're able to display their taste and knowledge in a manner that would confirm or deny their having access to a certain social position. So fundamentally, what Bourdieu is arguing here, he's saying that the origin of people in a system of inequality, where they begin, places constraints on their life chances not only because they're going to have unequal access to things like property and work, but because these things that accompany it, differences in taste, differences in access to networks, tend to reinforce the economic differences that constrain the abilities of people. So let's try to get into this in a bit more detail. Okay. Cultural capital in his book Distinction, Bourdieu asks about differences in taste and what differences in taste do. And he finds that generally there's a kind of correspondence. People in higher class positions will tend to prefer different sorts of cultural products that manifest this position. People in lower class positions will tend to prefer manifestations of working class culture and those positions in between, with some anomalies, but these anomalies are important. So if we take, for example, a person with access to a lot of economic capital, let's say somebody who has very quickly made a lot of money in business, or a professional football player, something like this, they will have access to a lot of wealth, but will continue to have the culture of the working class environment from which they come, meaning that they will have a limited ability to project the sense that the space that they are occupying is one where they belong. They'll tend toward gaudy things and so on. I mean, in fact, Bourdieu does this large-scale survey and has this wonderful graph showing the correspondences between social position and taste. But he finds the people with the most refined high cultural taste are not the people who occupy the most powerful cultural positions. In fact, it's school teachers. So what school teachers have is the ability not necessarily to claim access to a lot of property, but to claim access to a lot of social networks and to give the impression that the space that they occupy is one where they belong because of their intelligence and taste. If we think also about the position of people who occupy powerful stations in the social order but are rejected. Think of powerful politicians. This is very often because they project lower middle class or working class taste while occupying positions um, of enormous social power. So that one of the objections and one of the reasons why people reject a lot the public image of a lot of people holding political power is that although they control basic aspects of the lives of a lot of people, they don't display the level of education and refinement that would justify them occupying this position. This can work the other way too. If they display a lot of education and refinement, then they can be rejected as being unrepresentative, as unpopular. But I think what's important about these three forms of capital, economic, cultural, and social, in Bourdieu's definition of them, is that the non-economic forms of capital tend to be, for the most part, projections of economic capital. That is, that economic capital is converted into social and cultural capital, but it is not always converted perfectly. There are some anomalies between them, and these anomalies are interesting because it's the sort of thing that gives the children of teachers access to positions in the legal and corporate world and so on. Another important insight that would be drawn about Bourdieu is that class produces manifestations that are used against people in their efforts to gain access to social benefits. It's one of the reasons why, for example, in institutions like law firms, some questions are forbidden in job interviews because of their ability to produce a right or wrong answer that tells you whether the person would fit in. So that, for example, in the United States, if you're interviewing somebody for employment in a law firm, somebody with a law degree, one question you are not allowed to ask them is, what sport do you like to play? Because there's a right and a wrong answer. The right answer is tennis, and the wrong answer is basketball. And it's because preference for these sports indicates a class origin that is an indication of all of the informal and undefined ways in which somebody can be expected to fit in according to stereotypes that are dominant in a dominant culture and dominant class environment. Now, having gone through this cultural approach to class, let's talk about a functionalist approach. Uh, Now, what the functionalists argue is that class differences exist because they need to exist. That is, that they make an essential contribution to the functioning of the society. And probably the best known and most thoroughly articulated version of this is the hypothesis developed by Davis and Moore. That is, what they argue is that the difference in class positions and the difference in their ability to bring power and prestige and so on to people does not come from its ability to draw a high income, but rather the high income that a class position draws is a reflection of its importance to the functioning of the society and the scarcity of the skills that are involved for in the social environment. So they argue people in higher positions have these higher positions because the things they contribute are more essential and the skills that they have are rarer. So this is a justification for the existence of class difference. What we could argue is that it draws upon Emile Durkheim's theory that differences and inequalities are necessary because they contribute to the general cohesion of society. Now, let's talk a little bit about intersections, because what we can see, if you want to talk about factors like race and ethnicity, very often racial identities or ethnic identities tend to be strongly accompanied by class identities, and the reasons for this are very often historical. That is, they have to do with positions of political domination, of types of immigration, and so on. And in some cases, they take on a legal form in discrimination. So we can see some legal systems in which intersections between ethnicity and class are enforced. This is the basic functioning element of the apartheid system in South Africa. What this correspondence tells us is that very frequently differences that we think of as being racial or ethnic differences might in fact be class differences. That is, that differences that tend to accompany racial and ethnic differences are differences that come from the fact that members of different groups will tend to generally occupy different positions in the scale of work and access to property and social power, and that these become codified either in the form of informal discrimination on the level of social practice or in the form of law, that is, in the form of social practice of discrimination that takes the form of institutional practice. Uh, we can say something similar about gender, and the intersections between gender and class are multiple. There is a tendency in theory that tends to see a gender group as fundamentally a class interest group. So when the emphasis is placed, for example, on differences in earnings between men and women doing the same jobs and occupying the same positions in an organization, this could be regarded as a class difference, that the function of the discrimination is to maintain the distinction that is basically a class difference, a difference in access to power, a difference in access to social benefits between the genders. Now, we can do a little detour here into Marxism or into state systems that drew upon Marxism as a part of their ideological justification, because one element of state socialist systems was that they sought to implement in different ways equality between genders, developing a sort of state feminism that involved mostly bringing women out of the domestic sphere of work and into the paid sphere of work. This was a program that had some contradictory outcomes. What it often meant is that women were not brought out of the domestic sphere, but in addition to the work that they were compelled to do in order to maintain family and reproduce the labor power of other people, they also did work for a job for money. Now, the intersections that we have been talking about become very important in talking about some of the more contemporary interpretations of social difference, because what these intersectional theories tend to emphasize is the ways in which axes of division in a society, like race, like class, like gender, tend to feed into and reinforce one another, and possibly to create commonalities of interest across lines that would otherwise be lines of division. That is, they will make the argument, all women have something in common even if they're coming from different class locations. All members of a class have something in common, regardless of ethnic or racial or gender differences, and so on. And this intersectionality is a way in which we're able to take the complexity of the social environment and nonetheless understand how some of the fundamental axes of division that were already discussed in 19th century sociology are still important, but need to be looked at in the light of one another.